The cursed legacy of the Winstons. They hid 9 kids beneath a flooded mansion. Hurricane Delilah makes landfall on the Louisiana coast on September 23, 2024, bringing with it winds that exceed 140 miles per hour and a storm surge that rewrites the geography of the Mississippi Delta. For investigative journalist Amanda Pierce, stationed in New Orleans to cover the disaster's aftermath, the hurricane represents another climate change catastrophe in a region already battered by decades of environmental destruction. What she doesn't expect is that Delilah's floodwaters will wash away more than just topsoil and infrastructure. They will expose secrets that one of America's oldest families has spent over a century trying to hide. The Winston estate sits on a ridge overlooking the Atchafalaya Basin, approximately 40 miles southwest of Baton Rouge. Built in 1847 by tobacco and cotton magnate Reginald Winston, the mansion once commanded a view of thousands of acres of plantation land worked by enslaved people whose labor funded the family's rise to prominence. The 3-story Greek Revival mansion, with its massive white columns and wraparound verandas, had served as a symbol of Southern aristocracy for generations, housing a family whose influence extended from local politics to international banking. But Hurricane Delilah's storm surge, amplified by failing levees and decades of coastal erosion, pushes water 15 feet above normal flood levels. The Winston Mansion, which had survived the Civil War, Reconstruction, and countless smaller floods, finds itself completely submerged for the first time in its 177-year history. When the waters finally recede 4 days later, they leave behind devastation that transforms the estate from a monument to Southern grandeur into a scene from a nightmare. Amanda arrives at the Winston property 6 days after the hurricane, accompanying a FEMA damage assessment team tasked with evaluating the structural integrity of historic properties. The mansion's exterior walls remain standing, but the force of the floodwater has gutted the interior, stripping away layers of wallpaper, furniture, and family heirlooms that had accumulated over generations. What should be a routine documentation of storm damage becomes something far more sinister when the receding water reveals modifications to the mansion's foundation that don't appear on any architectural plans. The basement level, previously unknown to local historians and preservation societies, becomes visible only after the flood washes away decades of accumulated debris and concealment. Concrete walls, clearly added to the original foundation sometime in the early 20th century, create a series of chambers beneath the main house. Most disturbing of all, heavy iron doors, their hinges rusted but still functional, suggest rooms designed for confinement rather than storage. Amanda's initial documentation of the flood damage takes on investigative urgency when she discovers that the basement chambers contain evidence of recent habitation. Child-sized furniture, toys, and personal belongings scattered by the floodwater paint a picture of young people living in spaces that were never intended for human occupation. The concrete walls show signs of desperate scratching and impact damage, as if small hands and feet had repeatedly struck the surfaces in attempts to escape. The Winston family's response to media inquiries about the basement discovery is immediate and aggressive. Current family patriarch Harrison Winston, a prominent New Orleans attorney and philanthropist, issues statements denying any knowledge of the basement chambers and attributing their existence to previous owners or contractors working without family authorization. The family's legal team moves quickly to restrict access to the property, citing safety concerns and the need to preserve evidence for insurance investigations. But Amanda's research into the Winston family history reveals patterns that suggest the basement chambers represent only the most recent chapter in a legacy of secrets that stretches back to the mansion's construction. Public records show that throughout the 20th century, the Winston family repeatedly hosted children from orphanages and foster care systems, supposedly as part of charitable efforts to provide disadvantaged youth with educational and cultural opportunities. These arrangements, which local newspapers praised as examples of Southern hospitality and Christian charity, involved children staying at the Winston estate for periods ranging from several months to multiple years. However, follow-up reporting on these children's subsequent lives reveals a disturbing pattern. Many of the young people who stayed with the Winston family simply vanished from public records after their residency ended, with no documentation of their adult lives, careers, or families. The architectural evidence within the basement chambers tells a story of systematic confinement designed to appear benevolent while serving darker purposes. The rooms are furnished with beds, desks, and bookshelves, creating the appearance of dormitory-style accommodations. However, the heavy iron doors can only be secured from the outside, and the ventilation system is insufficient to support long-term habitation. Most tellingly, the windows that should provide natural light to basement rooms have been bricked over from the inside, creating perpetual darkness that could only have been maintained deliberately. Amanda's investigation into the Winston family's financial records reveals another disturbing pattern. Beginning in the 1920s, the family received regular payments from various charitable organizations, religious institutions, and government agencies for their child welfare services. These payments, substantial even by today's standards, continued for decades and represented a significant source of income for a family whose traditional plantation economy had collapsed after the Civil War. The documentation trail suggests that the Winston family developed a sophisticated system for acquiring children from institutions that were poorly regulated and often desperate to reduce their populations. Orphanages dealing with overcrowding and underfunding were willing to transfer children to families that appeared respectable and offered educational opportunities. Foster care systems, especially those serving minority and disadvantaged populations, had minimal oversight and rarely followed up on children once they were placed. The flood damage to the main house reveals additional evidence that transforms Amanda's investigation from historical research into a potential criminal case, hidden behind false walls in what was once the mansion's library. She discovers a collection of documents that detail the Winston family's activities over nearly a century. These papers, preserved in waterproof containers that suggest their contents, were considered valuable enough to protect, include contracts with orphanages, correspondence with government officials, and most disturbing of all, detailed records documenting the children who lived and died at the Winston estate. The records revealed that between 1923 and 2019, the Winston family hosted over 200 children for extended periods. Of these, only 47 are documented as leaving the estate alive. The remaining children are listed in various categories: medical complications, accidental deaths, transferred to specialized care, and most ominously, spiritual advancement, euphemisms that clearly mask systematic murder disguised as charitable work. The most recent entries in the Winston records document 9 children who arrived at the estate between 2017 and 2019. These children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, were officially transferred from overcrowded foster care systems in Louisiana and Mississippi. According to the records, they were to receive private tutoring, cultural enrichment, and preparation for eventual adoption by suitable families. The documentation ends abruptly in late 2019, with notations indicating that all 9 children had achieved spiritual advancement and would no longer require earthly care. As Amanda prepares to contact law enforcement with her discoveries, she makes a final, horrifying find in the deepest chamber of the basement complex. The floodwater has washed away layers of concrete and debris, revealing a mass grave containing the skeletal remains of multiple children. The bones, some showing signs of violence, while others suggest death from neglect and starvation, represent physical evidence of murder spanning decades. But the most disturbing discovery lies not in the grave itself, but in the ritualistic arrangement of the remains. The children's bones are positioned according to patterns that suggest occult significance, and artifacts found among the remains, candles, symbols carved in stone, and metal objects arranged in specific geometric patterns indicate that the Winston family's activities went beyond simple murder to encompass systematic ritual abuse and sacrifice. Chapter 1 concludes as Amanda realizes that the Winston estate was not simply a site of child abuse and murder, but the center of a cult that used charitable work as a cover for acquiring victims for ritualistic killing. The flood that was meant to destroy evidence has instead exposed a legacy of horror that reaches into the highest levels of Louisiana society and may continue to claim victims even today. The question that haunts Amanda as she leaves the flooded estate is not just how many children died in the basement chambers, but how many people in positions of authority knew about the Winston family's activities and chose to look the other way. The cursed legacy of the Winstons extends far beyond a single family to encompass an entire system of institutional neglect that allowed vulnerable children to disappear without investigation or accountability. The FBI investigation that follows Amanda's discovery unfolds like an archaeological excavation through layers of corruption, occultism, and systematic child murder spanning 4 generations of the Winston family. Special Agent Maria Santos, leading the Bureau's Crimes Against Children Unit, coordinates with forensic anthropologists, cult specialists, and financial investigators to uncover a network of ritual abuse that reached into the highest levels of Louisiana's political and social establishment. The forensic examination of the mass grave beneath the Winston mansion reveals evidence of ritualistic murder that follows patterns consistent with occult practices dating back to the early 20th century. The skeletal remains of 43 children, ranging in age from infancy to mid-teens, show signs of systematic torture, malnutrition, and ultimately death by various means, including strangulation, blunt force trauma, and what appears to be ritualistic dismemberment performed while the victims were still alive. Most disturbing of all, the forensic evidence reveals that the murders were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned rituals performed according to a specific calendar, tied to lunar cycles, solstices, and dates significant to various occult traditions. Carbon dating of the remains indicates that killings occurred regularly over nearly a century, suggesting that each generation of the Winston family continued and refined the ritualistic practices established by their predecessors. The investigation into the Winston family's background reveals that their involvement in occultism began with Reginald Winston's grandson, Cornelius Winston, who inherited the estate in 1919. Cornelius, educated at Harvard and Oxford, became fascinated with esoteric religions and occult practices during his time in Europe. He returned to Louisiana with a collection of rare books on ritual magic, demonology, and human sacrifice, along with connections to international occult societies that viewed children as particularly powerful sacrificial offerings. Cornelius Winston's transformation of the family estate from a traditional Southern mansion into a center for ritual murder was gradual and carefully planned. Beginning in the early 1920s, he began hosting what he described as spiritual retreats for like-minded individuals who shared his interest in occult practices. These gatherings, attended by wealthy and influential people from across the South, provided both financial support for the Winston family's activities and a network of accomplices who helped procure victims and cover up evidence. The documents recovered from the mansion's hidden library revealed that the Winston family's charitable work with orphanages and foster care systems was a carefully constructed facade, designed to provide a steady supply of victims for their ritualistic practices. The family developed relationships with corrupt officials and child welfare agencies, offering substantial bribes in exchange for access to children who were unlikely to be missed by anyone in the outside world. The victim selection process was systematic and calculated. The Winston family specifically targeted children who had no living relatives, had been abandoned by their families, or came from marginalized communities where disappearances were less likely to trigger intensive investigations. They showed particular preference for children who displayed unusual intelligence or artistic ability, believing that such individuals possessed spiritual qualities that would enhance the power of their rituals. The basement chambers beneath the mansion served multiple purposes in the Winston family's systematic abuse of children. The rooms functioned as holding areas where victims were kept for weeks or months while being prepared for sacrifice, through a process of psychological conditioning designed to break their will and prepare them for their eventual fate. The children were subjected to starvation, sensory deprivation, and various forms of torture that the Winston family believed would purify their souls and increase their value as sacrificial offerings. The investigation reveals that the Winston family's occult practices were not simply sadistic violence disguised as religious ritual, but part of a sophisticated belief system that viewed child sacrifice as a means of gaining supernatural power and material success. Family records document specific rituals performed to ensure business prosperity, political influence, and protection from legal consequences for their crimes. The most shocking aspect of the Ben's investigation is the discovery that the Winston family's activities were known to and enabled by a network of accomplices that included prominent figures in Louisiana's political, legal, and religious establishments. Bank records show regular payments to judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials who ensured that investigations into missing children were dropped or redirected away from the Winston estate. Religious leaders from various denominations received substantial donations from the Winston family in exchange for their silence about suspicious activities and their assistance in acquiring children from religious orphanages and charitable institutions. Politicians at the state and local level benefited from Winston family campaign contributions while ensuring that child welfare agencies remained underfunded and poorly supervised. The investigation into the 9 most recent victims reveals the full horror of the Winston family's final ritualistic murders. The children, all African American youths from disadvantaged backgrounds, were selected specifically for a ritual that Harrison Winston III believed would ensure his family's continued prosperity in the 21st century. The forensic evidence suggests that these children were tortured for weeks before being killed in a ceremony timed to coincide with the winter solstice of 2019. The discovery of video recordings hidden in the mansion's walls provides prosecutors with evidence of the actual ritual murders filmed by the Winston family as documentation of their spiritual practices. The recordings, too graphic to be shown publicly, demonstrate that the killings were performed according to specific occult procedures, designed to maximize the victim's suffering while channeling what the family believed was spiritual energy toward their own benefit. Agent Santos's investigation reveals that the Winston family's activities were part of a larger network of wealthy families throughout the American South who practiced similar forms of ritual abuse under the guise of charitable work and social prominence. The investigation identifies at least 12 other families in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia who may have participated in similar activities, suggesting that the Winston case represents only one example of a much larger pattern of systematic child sacrifice among America's elite. The legal proceedings against Harrison Winston III and surviving family members revealed the extent to which institutional corruption enabled decades of child murder. Defense attorneys argue that their clients were simply continuing family traditions and that their actions were protected as religious practices under the First Amendment. The prosecution's case demonstrates that the Winston family's activities constitute systematic murder and torture that no religious freedom protections can excuse. The trial reveals that the Winston family's wealth and social position provided them with protection that allowed their crimes to continue undetected for nearly a century. Witnesses testify about how corrupt officials actively suppressed investigations, how evidence was destroyed to protect the family's reputation, and how potential whistleblowers were intimidated into silence through threats and violence. The most compelling testimony comes from Sarah Matthews, now 34, who survived her stay at the Winston estate in 1998 by escaping during a failed ritual attempt. Her account of systematic torture, ritualistic abuse, and the murders of other children provides prosecutors with detailed evidence of the Winston family's methods and beliefs. Her survival, she explains, was possible only because a servant at the estate helped her escape during a power outage that disrupted one of the family's ceremonies. The investigation's conclusion reveals that Hurricane Delilah's flooding of the Winston estate was not the natural disaster that exposed the family's crimes, but rather divine justice that ensured their secrets could no longer remain hidden. The floodwaters that destroyed the mansion also preserved evidence that might otherwise have been destroyed, creating an archaeological record of nearly a century of systematic child murder. The story concludes with the conviction of Harrison, WinstonsThey and 3 family members on multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. However, the investigation's broader implications extend far beyond individual prosecutions to encompass systemic failures in child protection, institutional corruption, and the ease with which wealth and social position can be used to conceal even the most horrific crimes. The Winston estate itself is demolished following the conclusion of legal proceedings, with the property converted into a memorial garden honoring the victims of the family's ritualistic murders. The memorial includes the names of all identified victims and serves as a reminder that society's most vulnerable members require protection from those who would exploit their powerlessness for personal gain. The cursed legacy of the Winstons serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of wealth, power, and institutional corruption in enabling systematic abuse of children. It demonstrates how charitable work and social prominence can serve as effective camouflage for the most horrific crimes, and how inadequate oversight of child welfare systems creates opportunities for predators to acquire victims with minimal risk of detection. Most importantly, the Winston case highlights the need for robust, independent oversight of any institution that works with vulnerable children, and the importance of taking reports of abuse, even when they implicate wealthy and influential families. The children who died in the basement chambers of the Winston mansion were failed not just by their murderers, but by an entire system that valued social harmony and institutional reputation over the lives of society's most powerless members. In memory of the 43 children who died at the Winston estate. Their names are engraved in the memorial garden, where flowers now grow above the soil that once concealed their remains. Their deaths remind us that no amount of wealth or social position can justify the exploitation of innocence, and that justice, however delayed, will ultimately prevail.
Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,